Alright, welcome back to Intro to Python. This is lesson 2. So today we're going to be covering a wide array of topics. I think we're going to be covering conversion. We might get into conditionals and some loops, probably loops, conversions, and maybe conditionals. Anyways, let's pop over to Repl.it. I hope you're familiar with this IDE. It's at Repl.it.com. We are continuing from the last lesson, like a direct continuation. The code is all the same. I haven't touched it. So let's do a little recap very quickly. We went over variables, the different kinds of variables, int, string, boolean, float. We went over the print function, the syntax of that. We went over inputs, how to get the user to input information to the code, and how to concatenate strings, how to combine strings and variables so that we can have a cohesive output. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go over conversion. Conversion, let's see if I can find an image, is changing the type of variable that you have for it to work, right? You can see here, type conversion in Python. We're going to be going over explicit conversion, where you use this syntax at the bottom. Int, float. We're not going to be using oct or dict. We're going to be using string, float, and those are the main ones. But yes, sorry. And that's pretty much what a conversion is. That's the function to do that. And so why that is useful. I'll make another note. I'll go down a line. Conversion. Changing variable types. The reason why that's going to be important is, for example, if we need a number in this input, naturally it is a string. The input, what is your name? The input that user enters is going to be a string. Even if they enter a number, right? Let me run this code. I will show you. If I enter what is my name and I enter 5, right? That 5 is a string, not an integer. So therefore I can't do math with it. I can't make any calculations with it. It is, I'll give you a little visualization. That is what that 5 is. Okay, there's a difference between that, which is a string, and this, which is an integer. That's the difference. And this is what's being put into the input, because it's a string. Because we used the quotation marks using text to ask the question. And so, let's say we wanted an integer input. I'm going to make a new input. It's going to be called age. Age equals, and just like we saw before in that image, we're going to be using the variable type. We are going to be using the variable type, parentheses, and then whatever functions we want inside. What is your age? Sorry, I need to put that in quotation marks. There we go. Okay, so now what we enter in here is going to be an integer. And I know what you're probably thinking. What if we enter a string? What will happen, right? Or if we enter a float? So we'll go and enter, my name is Marcus. What is my age? Let's try and get it to run first. We'll say I'm 10 years old. Oh, Marcus, nice to meet you. Well, it doesn't do anything, but with it. Now let's see what happens if we enter a string, if we give it the wrong kind of variable type. And we'll just enter a bunch of random letters, strings, right? And then it's going to give us an error, invalid literal for int. Basically, what we entered was a string, which is not an integer. So now we can start doing math with that because we have an integer variable. We can create a new variable. New age equals age plus 10. And then we can say print in 10 years you will be, string concatenation, we need our plus, new age. Alright, let's give that a run. Oh, right, I'm sorry. This is also another thing. I completely skimmed over this. This is very important. Also conversion, right? Since we have an int here, right, that does not work with string concatenation because it's an int, right? You can't have, it's like trying to put a circular block inside a square hole. It doesn't work. It doesn't fit, right? We have a string and we have an int. It doesn't work. So we need this to be a string. We need this to be text so that we can output it. And just like we did here with this int, parentheses, integer, changing it to an integer, we're going to do it back to a string. String in parentheses, right? So now when we run this, we're getting it as an integer because we have this int keyword. And now back when we want to print it out, we need to change it to a string. So it's going from integer to string. I hope that makes sense. I'll talk about it a little bit more. We'll say I'm 10 years old. I will be 20. I'll add a space here. Right, so let me go over that, okay? When we're changing variable types using conversion, this is how we're going to write it. Yep, etc. And we're doing that to change whatever's in that parentheses, whether it be a string or anything that's different, to whatever we set it as, like an int, right? So here we have the int parentheses. We're changing whatever's in here, this input, to an integer. We're doing math with that, as you can see with new age. And then, once we have that value for new age that we want, we're converting new age, which is an integer. Since you're adding 10 to an integer, that's an integer. We're changing that to a string, which we can use to print. We're going from integer to string. We have it as an integer because we want to do math with it, and we're changing it to a string because we want to print it, right? The different methods that we use require different variable types, and thus require conversion. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Now, we're going to go over loops, okay? And loops are very important because that will introduce us to booleans. I mentioned in the first video how booleans are true or false, right? Loops, today this lesson we're going to be covering while loops. We'll cover for loops later. While loops, okay? While loops iterate, let me see if I can find a good image for this. Iterate as long as a certain thing is true. A boolean, a true or false. While this is true, this happens. Okay? Here, I think this is pretty good, right? While loop, expression, or people call this a conditional, okay? If it's true, then it'll run a certain amount of code, and it'll go back, okay? Is it still true? It is. Run it back. But the second it's false, then you exit the while loop. Then this code, whatever you have in the while loop, is no longer run. So let's look at the syntax of that, okay? We'll say this, okay? We'll use our previous variables of age. We'll say while age, okay, is less than 30, colon, print you are young, okay? And then what's very important about while loops is we need to change this variable. Otherwise, like for example, if we enter 10, otherwise, it's going to infinitely repeat and it's going to crash, okay? We need to change age. Like for example, if I enter 10, age is always going to be 10. So what it's going to do is it's going to print you are young over and over infinite amount of times because age is always infinitely less than 30. So we're going to say age plus equals, that's just another way of saying age equals age plus 10. Okay, these two lines are the exact same thing. It's just a different way to write it. It's an easier way to write it, in my opinion. And I'm going to get kind of sidetracked, but this is important. That thing works for minus equals. That works for divided equal. That works for times equals. All of those are the same thing, as I showed you. Okay, age plus equals 10. We're not using new age, we're using age. So the original input. So for example, 10, not 20, in this example. So we'll run it. Hello there, what is your name? Marcus. How old am I? We'll say 10. And it's going to print you are young twice. Okay, the reason for that is, I'll show you. We'll walk through the code of the while loop. Okay, age is set to 10. Is 10 less than 30? True. So it'll print you are young and it'll add 10 to age. So now age is 20. Is it less than 30? Yep. So it'll print you are young. So it prints you are young twice, and age is 30. Is 30 less than 30? No. 30 is not less than 30, so then it stops. Okay? And then it'll print whatever's after here. This is very important for code and to understand syntax, Python syntax. You have your while loop, right? Your name. And then you have this here is called conditional. This is the statement that's being tested whether it's true or false, okay? This is very important. This is a Boolean. This is a true or false. Age is less than 30. You are either going to get true or you are either going to get false. And if it's true, it'll do whatever is in here. The colon just signifies that it signifies the code that will come after the while loop. So whatever's after the colon, whatever lines is going to be run. And you can tell that the code is part of the while loop if it's indented. This is very important. Okay? Same thing with ifs, same thing with for loops, which we'll get later. If you see a colon and it's indented, that means it's part of that thing. It's part of that while loop. It's part of that conditional. Or, sorry, if, else, if. It's part of that thing. If it's indented, right, it's part of it. It's underneath it. It will run if it's true. I know that's a lot to take in. I hope it makes sense. Again, if you have any questions, ask in the Discord. But this is the way you want to write it. You have your while name, your conditional, your true or false statement, your colon, and you omit, this is very important, your indentations need to be correct with Python. Otherwise, you're going to get a ton of errors, okay? For example, if I have something like this, error, right? It's giving me an error message, expected indented block, okay? And now you can see here, if I change this, you can see how it's no longer indented. It's no longer part of the while loop, meaning this is going to run forever because age is not changing. And, well, it's not going to exit the while loop since we set age to 10. But if it ever does break, then it goes to this. It goes to the next lines, okay? So that's why it's important to know what's indented and what's not, so you can keep track of what's a part of which while loop. So I hope we're just going to cover those two topics, and it's already been 12 minutes. I've done a lot of rambling, but I really need to engrave these ideas, because with these concepts comes a lot of very important ideas to Python. Okay, so we went over a conversion. Let's go back to conversion. We'll do a little recap. Conversion is when you use this keyword of your variable type and then parentheses. And then whatever's in the parentheses is going to be changed to whatever variable type you set. Okay, and that is going to be helpful for performing different functions, right? Integers, we want to change things to integers to do math. We want to change things to strings to print them out. Okay, that's why conversion is very important. While loops. While loops are very important as, for example, I don't need to print out, like for example, I can just say while, if I have an integer, x equals 0. If I want to do something a lot amount of times, instead of saying print this a set amount of times, I can just do while x is less than 3, right? Print, we'll keep print you are young, x plus 1. X plus equals 1, right? So then you can see how, what is your name? Marcus. What is your age? 10. It'll print 3 times. So we don't have to keep writing print you are young, print you are young. We don't have to, it helps us save time on code and makes our code a lot more clean, okay? And you can see how before what we had, it can use a conditional, uses a conditional to test whether something is true or not, and does something a certain amount of times if it's true, right? And then we got introduced to the idea of how Python uses indentations to determine if code is a part of a larger concept, like an if or else or a while loop. We will go into if and else. I keep bringing that up. It'll probably be in the next lesson. Okay. So make sure you get this code down. Make sure you're understanding this. And that's it for this lesson. Just those two concepts. I would recommend practicing with it. Okay. Experiment with while loops. What kind of things can you do? Can you do equals? Can you do is greater or less than? Can you do greater or equal to, right? What kind of conditionals can you make, and what will you have in those while loops? And see if you can include conversion in that as well. Alright, thanks for watching.